Forget Hollywood powwows. Real native gatherings were wild survival festivals. Imagine feasts of 1,000 pounds of meat, enemies walking side by side, and seashells traded from oceans away. Here are stories about gatherings you never heard, and the last one will blow your mind. Traveling for days through dust, snow, and danger, just to reach the fire circle. Imagine hundreds of moccasins stamping trails into the dirt, horses snorting clouds of steam, and wagons creaking under loads of corn, hides, and dried meat. Getting to a native gathering wasn't easy. It was survival on the move. Some families traveled 50, 100, even 200 miles through snow-packed passes, dry plains, or swollen rivers. These weren't quick trips. They took days, sometimes weeks, with everyone from elders to toddlers making the journey. Why risk it? Because gatherings meant life. They were where you traded furs for obsidian blades, salmon for buffalo hides, salt for corn. They were where you'd hear news of raids, famines, or births across the land. Without them, villages could remain isolated, cut off, and vulnerable. Archaeologists at Cahokia, the great city near modern St. Louis, found evidence of traders from as far as the Gulf Coast and the Great Lakes. That's over 800 miles apart. For Plains tribes, horses made long travel possible after the 1700s. Before that, dogs carried gear on travois sleds, each dog hauling up to 60 pounds. The journey was brutal. Storms froze rivers, dust-blinded travelers, and raiding parties prowled the trails. Yet the reward was worth it. Safety in numbers, food shared in abundance, and the promise of alliances stronger than stone. One Lakota elder once said, "A man alone is meat for wolves. A village together is stronger than the storm." That's why families braved every danger. Because the fire circle at the end wasn't just warmth, it was survival itself. And once they finally arrived, the real spectacle began with feasts so massive they became a measure of power. Feasts so huge that power was measured in how many bellies you could fill. Picture this: smoke curling into the night sky, fires so big they glowed across the plains, and whole animals roasting on spits. At native gatherings, food wasn't just for eating, it was a performance of power. A chief or headman proved his strength by how much food he could provide, not by showing off gold or jewels. Think about buffalo. A single adult bull could weigh over 2,000 pounds, yielding nearly 800 pounds of edible meat. After a successful hunt, women worked furiously, cutting, drying, and boiling until literal mountains of food were ready. Some accounts describe entire buffalo herds butchered to feed hundreds during a festival. Bones boiled for marrow soup, hides roasted for chewy snacks, and tongues, the delicacy, saved for honored guests. On the Pacific Northwest coast, salmon runs fueled equally grand feasts. The Haida, Tlingit, and Coast Salish stored thousands of pounds of smoked fish in cedar boxes. When gatherings came, they opened them all at once. Early explorers wrote of rows of salmon hanging like silver curtains above fire pits, enough to feed a crowd for days. But here's the scandal. It wasn't really about filling stomachs, it was about status. Among the Plains tribes, wasting food during feasts, literally throwing chunks of meat into the fire, was a public flex. It said, "We are so rich we can give some back to the spirits." Among the Northwest peoples, lavish potlatch feasts even included giving away possessions, blankets, tools, or canoes, as symbols of strength. Hungry bellies were filled, yes, but reputations were made, alliances sealed, and enemies humbled by one truth. A leader who fed you was a leader you respected. And once the food fueled the bodies, the music began, and it wouldn't stop for days. Songs and drums that pounded through the night until feet bled and voices broke. Now imagine this: the feast is done, bellies are full, and the drums begin. But they don't stop after an hour. They don't even stop after the sun goes down. In some gatherings, the music and dancing went on for 2, 3, even 4 days straight. Sleep became optional. Participation was survival. Drums carved from hollow logs, stretched tight with buffalo hide, could be heard for miles across the plains. Some explorers in the 1800s wrote that the beat seemed to carry through the bones more than the ears. Voices joined in layered chants, weaving rhythm with words that carried stories, prayers, and challenges. Dances weren't casual fun. They were endurance tests. The Lakota sun dance, for example, could last 4 days without food or water for those in the ritual. Feet blistered, muscles cramped, and yet people kept moving because stopping meant dishonor. Even outside of ritual, dancers could collapse from exhaustion, only to rise again when the drum called. Here's something wild. Music wasn't just entertainment, it was a tool. Drumming regulated heartbeats, heightened adrenaline, and synchronized groups. Scientists today call it entrainment, where your body literally locks into a rhythm. Plains warriors trained this way because if hundreds of feet could move as one to a drum, they could move as one in battle. Children learned the patterns early, clapping until their palms stung. Elders led with songs older than memory. Some melodies survived centuries without ever being written down. One wrong verse wasn't just embarrassing, it risked angering the spirits the songs called upon. By dawn, when voices cracked and bodies staggered, the gatherings weren't weakening. They were building energy for what came next. Unions, alliances, and marriages that could change the fate of entire nations. Weddings that weren't just love stories. They could stop a war before it began. Forget romance novels. At native gatherings, weddings were political chess moves. A single marriage could unite villages, forge peace, or prevent bloodshed that might last for generations. Picture this: 2 clans locked in rivalry, raiding each other's camps, stealing horses. Then suddenly a wedding is arranged between a warrior's daughter and the rival chief's son. Overnight, enemies become family. Among the Comanche and Kiowa, marriages often included exchanges of horses, sometimes 10, 20, even 50 animals, to prove respect and wealth. In Iroquois councils, a marriage wasn't just personal, it was communal. The famous Iroquois Confederacy, linking 5 nations into one, depended on kinship ties woven together through marriage alliances. Food and feasts sealed the deal. Archaeological evidence from Mississippian towns like Cahokia shows banquets with thousands of clay serving bowls, proof of gatherings where entire populations ate together to celebrate unions. And the stakes? Huge, because a wedding wasn't only about 2 people. It was about ensuring trade routes stayed open, hunts were shared, and blood didn't spill. But love wasn't absent. Songs, dances, and gifts marked unions, while families offered blankets, beadwork, and precious shells from faraway coasts. One Lakota elder later said, "When a woman joined another camp, she carried not only her body, but her people's peace. That peace could last decades, or collapse if the marriage soured. Sometimes weddings weren't planned at all. Captives taken in raids could become wives, binding their families into enemy camps. It was risky, scandalous, and sometimes transformative, changing hatred into kinship. By the end of these unions, the drums beat again, but now for games where battles were fought not with weapons, but with speed, strength, and strategy. When rivals shared the same campfire and no one dared draw a blade, picture it, enemies who had stolen each other's horses last season, now sitting shoulder to shoulder by the same fire. That wasn't a dream. It was the reality of sacred truce zones during great native gatherings. These were moments when survival, trade, and ceremony outweighed revenge. The Iroquois Confederacy had the famous Great Law of Peace, where rival nations like the Mohawk and Oneida were bound to sit together without bloodshed. Similar truces existed across the plains. At annual Sundance gatherings, even the fiercest enemies, the Lakota and Crow, for example, could walk side by side without drawing a bow. If you broke the truce, you risked spiritual wrath and losing every alliance you had. Archaeologists studying large campsites along the Missouri River found evidence of temporary settlements with thousands of fire pits, proof that multiple nations camped together. Imagine hundreds of lodges packed into a valley, guarded not by warriors but by custom. But it wasn't all peace and smiles. Tension buzzed under the surface. Every word, every glance mattered. Warriors carried scars, women remembered raids, and children eyed strangers with suspicion. Yet people endured it because the rewards, safe trade, new marriages, shared rituals, were too valuable to lose. One elder explained it best. "We ate beside the man who once tried to kill us. We did it because our children needed the food." That's not weakness. It's survival dressed as ceremony. The firelight didn't erase grudges, but it bought time. And in that pause, another power stirred. The markets where goods from oceans and mountains flowed like rivers into one camp. Markets where seashells from the Pacific met, buffalo skins from the plains. Now picture a gathering not as a feast or a ceremony, but as a living marketplace. Thousands of people trading treasures from places you'd never expect. Seashells from the Pacific, bright turquoise from the Southwest, obsidian blades from volcanic mountains, and buffalo hides from the Great Plains all ended up in the same circle of trade. Archaeologists digging at Cahokia, the massive Mississippian city near modern-day St. Louis, found marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico, copper from the Great Lakes, and mica from the Appalachian Mountains. That's trade spanning over 1,000 miles in every direction. Imagine carrying goods across forests, rivers, and deserts just to pass them hand to hand at a gathering. On the plains, a single buffalo robe could buy shells, salt, or even parrot feathers from Mesoamerica. Yes, scarlet macaw feathers have been found in Pueblo ruins in New Mexico, carried north through trade routes stretching hundreds of miles. Meanwhile, Navajo weavers might bring blankets dyed with natural indigo, exchanged for knives or beads from faraway places. These weren't casual swaps. They were survival systems. Salt, for example, was priceless. Tribes near salt springs could trade handfuls of the white crystals for food, weapons, or even horses. A cache of turquoise beads from Chaco Canyon shows how valuable stones became currency. But here's the wow fact. It wasn't just goods being traded, it was knowledge. Recipes, songs, farming tricks, and even alliances moved along with shells and hides. A simple bracelet might carry not just beauty, but a story that bound two nations closer. Markets turned gatherings into more than local festivals. They became engines of connection, weaving together a continent-wide web of trade that even Europe would envy. And once the trading slowed, the real stage opened, the fire circle, where words held sharper edges than arrows. Stories told around the fire could crown a hero or destroy a reputation forever. The fire circle wasn't just for warmth, it was a courtroom, a stage, and a history book all in one. When elders spoke, everyone listened, because the words carried more weight than weapons. A warrior could earn immortality here, or see his name erased with a single tale. Among the Lakota, stories of bravery, like touching an enemy in battle without killing him, known as counting coup, were retold again and again, sometimes for decades. The Comanche measured greatness by horse raids, and around the flames, a man's stolen herd might sound like a king's ransom. But lies didn't survive the fire. If a warrior boasted falsely, others who were there could challenge him publicly. Imagine the shame of being unmasked in front of your entire camp. Anthropologists studying Plains gatherings noted that oral tradition wasn't casual memory. It was historical record. Archaeological digs at large camps show fire pits surrounded by seating rings, evidence of these nightly councils. The fire burned, but so did reputations. It wasn't only men's stories that mattered. Women, too, passed down accounts of famine, migration, and resilience. A grandmother's voice could preserve the knowledge of a drought from 50 years before, guiding how the community prepared for the next. Words had survival value. Here's a striking detail. The average child in these circles could recite lineages back 6 or 7 generations. That's like a modern kid knowing the names of ancestors from the 1600s. Stories weren't just entertainment, they were maps, moral codes, and family archives. And when the drums returned, stories gave way to contests where heroes weren't made by words, but by blood and sweat. Games where bodies collided like war, and sometimes broke like war too. Games where hundreds crashed together, and sometimes walked away broken. If you picture a friendly backyard game, forget it. When native nations gathered, their games were fierce, massive, and dangerous. More like battles disguised as sport. The most famous? Stickball, the ancestor of modern lacrosse. And it wasn't played by 10 people. Some matches involved hundreds of players on each side, sprinting across fields that stretched up to 2 miles long. The Cherokee called it a netza, and French observers in the 1700s wrote with shock about the speed and violence. Players could use sticks to check, tackle, or block, and broken bones were common. Sometimes warriors smeared their bodies with paint and carried charms, treating the game as a sacred ritual to honor the spirits. Winning wasn't just pride, it was prayer, training, and destiny all at once. Other nations used games to prepare for war. The Choctaw played stickball matches where entire villages bet food, blankets, or horses. An early report from 1739 described 1,000 people watching, with drummers, singers, and medicine men guiding players like generals. Before kickoff, the teams danced all night, seeking visions and strength from the unseen. Why so rough? Because these games doubled as survival training. Sprinting for miles built endurance for hunts and raids. Dodging hits mirrored the reflexes needed to escape arrows or lances. And maybe most important, collisions toughened warriors' bodies and spirits. But here's the twist. Even women sometimes joined in. Among the Choctaw, women would play in mixed matches, taunting men with speed and agility. Outsiders saw only chaos. Insiders saw a community's pulse beating in rhythm with every strike of the sticks. And when the last goal was scored, bruises weren't the end. Because after games came ceremonies, rituals outsiders were never meant to see, carrying secrets as guarded as any fortress. Sacred ceremonies outsiders were never meant to witness. If the games were public, the ceremonies were private, sometimes deadly private. These weren't shows. They were contracts with the spirits, rituals that held communities together across centuries. Outsiders who stumbled in could be chased off, or worse, because certain sites weren't meant for uninitiated eyes. Take the sun dance among the Plains tribes. Every summer, whole camps came together for this ritual of sacrifice and renewal. Warriors pierced their skin with bone skewers tied to poles, then danced until the flesh tore free. To modern eyes, it looks like torture. To the Lakota or Cheyenne, it was strength offered to the universe, ensuring buffalo would return and people would live. In 1877, U.S. soldiers counted over 500 participants in a single Sundance circle, a sight both mesmerizing and terrifying to them. Farther southwest, the Hopi held Kachina dances. Men wearing carved wooden masks embodied spiritual beings, bringing rain, fertility, and blessings. These weren't costumes. They were living presences. Children learned to recognize them as sacred visitors, not performers. Archaeologists have found Kachina masks carefully stored in sealed chambers, proof of how seriously they were treated. Healing ceremonies, too, carried power. Navajo nightway rituals could last 9 nights straight, with chants longer than entire novels. Sand paintings created with colored minerals mapped the cosmos on the ground, then were destroyed at dawn so their sacred energy wouldn't linger dangerously. Spanish missionaries and later American officials often banned these rituals, calling them pagan, but they survived underground, hidden in private spaces, whispered across generations. Today they still live, proof of resilience no law could erase. When the last song ended and fires burned low, another arena opened. Stories weren't enough, ceremonies weren't enough. These gatherings were also where nations themselves were stitched together through food, memory, and shared law. Gatherings that built nations out of food, faith, trade, and memory. Imagine a single event where politics, religion, survival, and joy all blended into one. That's what great native gatherings were. They weren't festivals the way we think today. They were how entire peoples reaffirmed who they were, renewed alliances, and set the course for generations. Food was always the foundation. Archaeological digs at Mississippi and mound sites show storage pits that once held thousands of bushels of corn, enough to feed thousands of visitors for weeks. Beans, squash, dried bison meat, smoked fish, and nuts were brought from villages across vast distances. Eating together wasn't just about filling bellies, it was about sealing trust. Sharing food was sharing life, faith layered on top. A Sundance on the Plains or a Kachina dance in the Southwest wasn't entertainment. It was collective survival made visible. Anthropologists record that during large dances, hundreds of drums could beat at once, echoing like a heartbeat across the valley. Children learned identity not from textbooks but from standing in those circles. Trade stitched nations together, seashells from the Pacific, obsidian from Yellowstone, turquoise from the Southwest, copper from the Great Lakes, all met in the same camp. One archaeologist counted over 200 non-local materials at Cahokia alone, proving how far these networks stretched, and memory held it all. Elders recited genealogies, warriors' deeds, and migration stories. Decisions about peace, war, or alliances were made in these councils. In short, gatherings weren't optional. They were government, church, market, and university rolled into one. But here's the irony. Outsiders often dismiss these as dances or powwows, never realizing they were watching nations in motion. The echoes of those gatherings still ripple today in modern powwows, treaty commemorations, and tribal councils. Gatherings weren't parties. They were survival, power, and memory woven together. If you want more hidden history, tap the next video on screen. Subscribe and keep exploring with us, because the past still has secrets waiting for you.